Welcome to the Schoolhouse Lecture Series. I think this is about our 7th or 8th lecture, and I'm glad to see everyone out tonight. With that, I'm going to introduce Deanna and Hugh. They are longtime Cleveland Heights people who I met when they were first researching their houses and then their neighborhood, and they just couldn't stop researching, and they researched so much that they decided to write a book out of it. So I'll leave this to you, and they can tell you about the process and share some of these great old photographs with you.
Thank you, Kara, and we're going to tag team this, so we'll switch off here and there. One of us has got to be down there to flip the slide, so have you. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to do tonight, we're going to give you some context for this first. We're going to talk a little bit about Cleveland, and then talk about the development in the Heights, and then we'll go into specifically some of the neighborhoods that were developed in the Heights, and then finally talk about Euclid Golf and Howell and Thomas architects, which were the primary architects for the allotment, and even a little bit about Euclid Golf today. Well, first of all, a little bit about the area. Fairmount Boulevard, which runs right through Euclid Golf, has been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1976, and that district runs from the intersection of Fairmount and Cedar all the way up to Fairmount and Wellington. And then in 2002, Hugh and I worked on a National Register nomination for all of Euclid Golf. We start out on Euclid Avenue. This is the Everett House on Euclid Avenue. And the reason we start here is because this is where Cleveland's elite lived in the 1880s, 1890s. And this is one of the ground houses there. And what happened then to Euclid Avenue, which of course was well known throughout the world, was all of the immigration and success that Cleveland had was bringing in immigrants. They were overcrowding the city. Cleveland was not a very healthful place to live, not only because of the overcrowding, but because of the pollution. And Euclid Avenue was being overrun. Many of these homes that were there were being crowded out, and people who were living along the avenue there really felt like they needed to move further and further out along Euclid Avenue into the University Circle area and finally into the Heights. This is a photo of the Heights area. We're not exactly sure where this is, but this shows you the rural nature of the area. It says that it's Lake Drive, but that really could be anywhere. A lot of the street names have changed. But it was a very rural area at the turn of the century. Farms, the area that is now Euclid Golf was a timber farm. Orchards, the Shakers lived in the Heights, the area that's now known as Shaker Heights. It's another view. This says Shaker Road and Boulevard area. So this gives you some idea of what was here. There really wasn't much development, partly because it was so far away from the city of Cleveland and people had very little way to get here, but also because of the fact that it was on the Heights itself. When we start getting to streetcars, areas such as East Cleveland were developed first because it was a straight run from Cleveland to East Cleveland, but to get up the Heights required traction. So you didn't see the development until then. We talked a little bit about the immigration and the overcrowding and the pollution that was going on in Cleveland, and one of the responses to that was a movement that started in England, which is called the Garden City Movement. And it was a response to these overcrowded cities and the unhealthy living conditions that people were experiencing. And so people were starting to say that we really ought to create a system of parks, and that's when Cleveland's park system began to be developed. And not only that, but instead of having houses on a grid-like pattern, cheek and jowl together, we really ought to create more park-like settings for homes and have wide expanses of lawn, beautiful vistas, all of those kinds of things. And because it originated in England, a lot of the developments that were modeled after Garden City had English names to sort of evoke that setting. And so Cleveland's park system, which we now know as our Cleveland Metro Parks, was started by, of course, some of the movers and shakers such as John D. Rockefeller, and he was really instrumental in getting a lot of the other landowners to donate land to become part of the park system. And so Gordon Park, Rockefeller Park, Wade Park, all of those parks were created in the 1890s, starting up at the Shaker Lakes and going down all the way to Lake Erie. And this is a photo of Rockefeller Park. probably in the 1890s, turn of the century. And this is Patrick Calhoun. And Patrick Calhoun was a railwayman, and he was the grandson of the U.S. Vice President. He came to Cleveland on railway business, had some extra time on his hands, and he had been one of the people who had donated money to build the Garfield Monument. So he wanted to see the Garfield Monument. So he came out with his friend, came up Cedar Hill, and this is what Cedar Hill looked like at that point in time, pretty dirty and muddy. Came up Cedar Hill to see the Garfield Monument. This is a shot from the 1940s, but you can see here that, that the streetcar goes down. As you're looking up Cedar Hill, it would have been on your right-hand side, and you know now that there's sort of that grassy park-like area, and that was the right-of-way for the streetcar. So when Patrick Calhoun took a look at what was then the Heights and pretty much was farmland, saw Garfield Monument and saw the surrounding area, he said, you know, this would really make a great place for a residential development, a high-class residential development. And the only two approaches to this were either muddy Cedar Hill or through Little Italy, neither one of which he thought was really appropriate for the high-class residential development he wanted to build. And so he got the Lake Erie Railway Company to have a right-of-way go up Cedar Hill. This is a map to kind of orient you a bit. We were just talking about Cedar Glen, that one photo here. And Patrick Calhoun laid out this area here called Euclid Heights and developed this road here where the streetcar would come up Cedar Glen and go right down what he called at the time Euclid Boulevard. And we were just having a discussion about why it was called Euclid Heights and Euclid Boulevard. And he envisioned a high-class residential development, and so he was trying to entice people from Euclid Avenue to move up to the Heights. And so he called it Euclid Heights. Some of the other developments that were going on, here is Lakeview Cemetery, where Garfield Monument is. When he got the streetcar to come up Cedar Hill, there was also a streetcar that was going up Mayfield. And other streetcar suburbs such as Mayfield Heights were being developed. Grant Deming's Forest Hill, Rockefeller was an investor in this area, and so Grant Deming named it after Rockefeller's Forest Hill country estate. And Ambler Heights is another area that was being developed. I'll also show you, this is where Euclid Golf is. This Cedar Heights area is basically Grandview and Belfield. And that was actually developed sort of contemporaneously with Euclid Heights, perhaps even a little bit earlier. And it was developed on a grid pattern, just like the city streets were, whereas Euclid Heights, as you can see from the curving streets, was developed along the Garden City model. One other allotment I want to point out is Shaker Village down here. The Van Sweringen brothers were beginning to develop what would eventually become Shaker Heights, and the first area that they developed was along Fairmount Boulevard here in what is today Cleveland Heights, but then it was known as Shaker Heights. And these are the two Van Sweringen brothers, OP and MJ, and they kind of got their start around the turn of the century doing smaller projects, and pretty soon they gained control of the allotment that became Shaker Village and controlled all of it. One of the things that they very quickly realized is that they needed to get a streetcar to their development. Was really the only way that people could get there. This is a map showing where their Shaker Village, initial Shaker Village allotment was. This is Fairmount Boulevard going right down here. And in about 1906, they convinced the railway company to put a trolley line from Patrick Calhoun's line up here at Cedar and take it through this property here down to their property so that they would have a streetcar line going through their property. And that was in 1906. In order to do that, they had to negotiate with the landowner here, which happens to be John D. Rockefeller. And here are some advertisements from the Van Sweringen Shaker Heights. And notice some of the things they talk about. They talk about natural surroundings and breathing space, absence of dirt and smoke and noise, all of these things that people are escaping from. They're coming out to Shaker Heights Village, and they're finding there a thing of beauty and joy forever. And that was important to them because, as I mentioned, people along Euclid Avenue were seeing their homes being overrun by the crowded city. In Shaker Village, they had deed restrictions that would give people a sense of permanence, that there wasn't going to be industry there wasn't going to be apartment houses there. This would stay in this idyllic state forever. And here are a few other examples of advertisements from the Van Swearingen development. This particular house is on Fairmount Boulevard and designed by Frederick Strebinger. And yet another home, again, this one's along Fairmount Boulevard as well. And this one, which if you look closely you may recognize, this is the Tremaine Gallagher house on Fairmount Boulevard. And one of the original owners of it, Mr. Tremaine, was a treasurer of the Peerless Motor Car Company. And he had their annual report shot at his house. And this is actually a cover of Town Topics, but this is a photo from that report. Now, Patrick Calhoun was at the same time developing Euclid Heights, and one of the things that he realized, in addition to public transportation, was that he also needed to have something to entice the wealthy up there for their recreation. And so he, in 1901, opened up the Euclid Club. And Mead and Garfield, the firm of Mead and Garfield, designed the clubhouse for that. Garfield is the son of the president. And they hired golf pro Herbert Bertie Way from Detroit to come lay out the course. And one of the things that they noticed very early on is that they didn't quite have enough land for all 18 holes. So that was a bit of a problem. This is a postcard of the clubhouse. This clubhouse was located at the corner of Cedar Road and Norfolk. We'll show that to you on a map in just a moment. And this is another view of the clubhouse and the first tee. And here's the map we want to show you. This is the Alcazar Hotel. This is Cedar Road. Of course, the Alcazar didn't exist at the time, but it gives you a little bit of a landmark there. And here's the Euclid Clubhouse. There's Derbyshire Road and Norfolk. So right where the Euclid Clubhouse was, today there are a couple houses and a parking lot here. And so this shows you the golf links. And what they did is Patrick Calhoun negotiated with Rockefeller and was able to get the upper links of his golf course on Rockefeller's land. So what you would do is you'd start out here at tee number 1 from the clubhouse, and you'd go down here to what is today Delaware and South Overlook. You would play down here, and you'd come back to the clubhouse. And the reason why they had to lay it out that way is because on Sundays, Rockefeller didn't want anybody playing golf on his land. So on other days, you could tee off here again and go and do the whole 18, and on Sunday you had to do 2 loops on the lower links. Rockefeller, as you know, was an adamant Baptist, and so he didn't want anybody playing golf on Sunday. And here's a picture of John D. Rockefeller. And just a little bit more about him, you know that he had a summer home called Forest Hill that's in northern Cleveland Heights in East Cleveland. And what you may not know about him is that he invested in a lot of real estate in the Heights. He was an investor in Patrick Calhoun's Euclid Heights development. He also was an investor in Grant Deming's Forest Hill allotment that Grant named after his property in East Cleveland. And he was also an investor in the Shaker Heights Land Development Company, which became the Van Swearingen Brothers Shaker Village. And this is just what we talked about leasing the land to the clubhouse. And what's going on then with all of these developments that are going on in the Heights, and then you've got this golf course where you can only play full 18 holes 6 days of the week, and then you've also got a streetcar going through it. It's beginning to seem that maybe this is not the best use for this land. And so Rockefeller starts entertaining proposals for redevelopment of this land. And in 1912, the Euclid Club disbands, and they go on to form the Mayfield Country Club and the Shaker Heights Country Club. And enter Barton Roy Deming. Now, Barton Deming was born in Canada, but his parents were Americans. And in 1892, he followed his brothers to Cleveland, and a number of them became involved in real estate. They developed a lot of property in the East Cleveland area, and then, of course, his brother Grant developed the area of Cleveland Heights that was known as Forest Hill. And then in 1913, he made a proposal to Rockefeller, which was accepted, to develop the Euclid Golf Club links into the Euclid Golf allotment. His company, the B.R. Deming Company, also built many of the homes in Euclid Golf. So not only was he a developer, but he was also a builder. And his home at 2485 Fairmount Boulevard was his home for 25 years, and I think you'll recognize it once you see a picture of it. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Hugh.
As part of our research for this project, we were lucky enough to come across a lot of vintage photographs that no one had ever seen before, and we'll tell you more about that process a little bit later. But our historic photos of the Euclid Golf area begin with this shot taken. This is actually an early 1913 photograph of taken standing on Cedar Road, looking at what would become the foot of Fairmount Boulevard. And right now there's the Cedar, the Mad Greek sits here, just to orient you. So that's what it looked like at the time that Deming started to develop. Moving a few hundred yards up the street, or what would become the street, we see this would become Fairmount Boulevard, and Ardley Drive peels off about right here. Currently, and what you see in the distance is the clearing that is the part of the golf course. And in the distance, this is the old Roxborough Elementary School. Moving another 100 yards along the way, this is a really interesting shot because we're clearly seeing that this is the open space for the golf course, the upper 9 holes, and you can see one of the things that the golfers were contending with, and that was streetcars running right through their golf course. So. Convenient for the travelers, but not for the golfers.
Who had to yield?
Good question. Good question. Yeah. Who got to play through? I wonder. Yeah. This is a really interesting shot. For a couple things we're seeing here. First of all, you always have to remember that Deming was a consummate marketer. He really understood marketing as well as real estate development. And we presume that he was the one who was having these photographs taken. But what he was doing was he was marking where he was going to put the streets. And the sign says Delamere Drive, so this is where Delamere Drive would be. And you can see the railroad tracks. And this right here is actually the roof line of the clubhouse. So, and the clubhouse, again, is between Cedar and Derbyshire, so you can see its proximity. And that's where the golfers would come up from Cedar. Oh, and one other interesting thing is, where is it? This right here is the Garfield Monument.
What's the structure on the right?
There's a large house right there. There was a large house to the left as well. There were already houses along Cedar, very, very grand houses. Moving a little bit farther along, the Euclid Golf land had both open land where the golf course was, as well as densely wooded land, and this is about where Tudor and Woodmere would later be put. This is looking north from what would be Fairmount, along where Demington was put in. And actually, Deming tells us that, fortunately. And along the way, there were these small little shanties. We presume they were little station stops, places for people to stand and wait for the trolley to come along. This shot is taken it's actually standing on Cedar Road looking south along what would be Demington. So Demington would come up. This is the opposite view of the shot that we just saw. And even though there were very grand houses along most of Cedar, there were still some remnants of some not so grand houses, complete with outhouse. This was did not follow Deming's vision for Euclid Golf, and this house would not last too much longer. And actually getting to the end of the line, this shot is we're standing on Coventry. So this is where today Fairmount Boulevard comes out onto Coventry. And you can see a little station there, a man sitting on a pile of gravel waiting for his trolley ride. St. Paul's Church is right here. So it's basically the front lawn of St. Paul's. This end of Euclid Golf was an orchard at the time. Now, so we just took you from the beginning of the line to the end of the line on Fairmount, and this is the allotment map that Deming developed, and it shows all the layouts of the streets, all the lots that were available. And this was the plan that Deming developed and that Rockefeller approved of. There was a lot of people who were interested in this land and who had made proposals, but Rockefeller liked Deming's plan because it was a mixture of large lots for large houses and somewhat smaller lots for somewhat more modest houses on the side streets, and resulting in a mixture of economic levels in the neighborhood. Unlike, say, Patrick Calhoun's Euclid Heights, which is mostly very, very grand houses, and Calhoun went bankrupt. In the end, there were lots of things going on with real estate at the time, but he couldn't make a go of it. Deming's vision was to develop the finest residential neighborhood in Cleveland. That was his stated goal. To do that, he retained the architectural firm of Howell and Thomas. They were from Columbus, and he urged them to move up from Columbus to Cleveland and to become his architects. He laid out the area with Garden City principles. There were deed restrictions on the buyers, the architects and builders. There couldn't be any incompatible uses. There were certain required investment levels on each street. Required setbacks, and those deed restrictions were in place until 1950. We'll come back to this, his building some houses outside of Euclid Golf. And his home really became a gateway and an advertisement for the allotment. And this is his house. I think you'll all recognize it. This was designed by Howell and Thomas for Barton Deming and his wife. And the brief that the architects really worked with Mrs. Deming on the design, but the only brief that Barton Deming gave the architects was, I want my house to be a suitable advertisement for the grandeur of what would become Euclid Golf. And we really think that he succeeded. This is the upper garden. This shot was taken in 1920, but this was the upper garden. And this stone pergola still exists. This is the back of the house. Most people don't know that that it looked like this behind there. There was extensive woodland gardens behind here. And actually there was a house next door owned by a man by the name of Miller. And these woodland gardens were actually Miller's gardens, but Deming obviously had the use of them. But we believe that this is Deming himself, and one of these kids is probably his daughter. This is an interior of his house, taken in 1920. This is now the very beginning of the actual development of Euclid Golf, and this is the Demington Drive, taken from what would become Fairmount Boulevard, and they're actually hand digging the sewers. It's the beginning of the development. Early on, Deming established a real estate office, and this was his first office, and this was on Coventry Road, actually on what is now the front lawn of St. Paul's. This was his second real estate office, and this was at the corner of Demington and Fairmount Boulevard. And as you can see, he dispensed with the kind of the garish advertising graphics that he had on the first building, and opted more for trellises and pergolas and window boxes, and really more in keeping with his vision for Euclid Golf. Here's some construction shots. This is actually Demington Drive being graded and rolled out. This is also Demington Drive, but this is taken looking south from Fairmount Boulevard, and you can see the combination of steam power, horsepower, and manpower at work here. And this is interesting because this house is a very early Euclid Golf house that Deming built, interestingly, before there was even a street in place. And this is that house. It's on Demington. This house is interesting. It's a Howell and Thomas design, a very early one, and the early designs were really rather different than the later designs. And this house is interesting in a couple respects. One is it's one of only two houses ever in Euclid Golf that had a full-length front porch. It's also very unusual in that this feature is actually now gone, and it's unusual because essentially nothing's been changed in Euclid Golf since. As you drive around and look at vintage photos, they pretty much look identical to today. So that's unusual that a major architectural feature was lost. This is Fairmount Boulevard. This is Ardley right here. That's the circle that exists today at Fairmount and Ardley. More shots of construction. This is Fairmount Boulevard. The north part of Fairmount Boulevard was developed first. The south part is still undeveloped. This construction activity right over here is for this house, which was actually the very first house that Deming built in Euclid Golf. It's on Fairmount Boulevard. It was designed by an architect called P.E. Robinson. The house looks absolutely identical today. You wouldn't, this could be a modern photograph.
Trees are larger.
Trees are larger, yeah. Yeah. What Deming was doing, I said that he was a marketer. He erected billboards at the foot of each street, and these were obviously designed for the riders on the streetcar so that they could see what was going on, advertising what was going on in the street. This is actually the very first house on Chatfield, which was built in early 1914. This is that house. It's a Howell and Thomas design. These very early designs are different than the later designs I mentioned, much more a garden principle, a lot of trellises and window boxes, and much more overtly American designs early on. This is another view of Chatfield Drive, of some houses being built. This is the one that we just saw. This is one under construction, and here's one just as in foundation. Those houses are completed a year later on Chatfield. This is Clarkson right here. View from Fairmount panorama, looking at houses on Chatfield and North St. James in various stages of construction. More street scenes, billboards at the foot of the drive, in this case Tudor Drive. This is the house that we saw on Tudor Drive. It's a Howell and Thomas design. The house looks identical today, with the exception the trellises are gone. Just another shot of Fairmount of the allotment office at the corner of Fairmount and Demington. This is a house on Chatfield Drive. It's a lovely Howell and Thomas design. Interesting history of this house. The original owner was Dr. Aladar Paz, P-A-C-Z. He was a scientist who worked for General Electric, and he actually invented the non-sag tungsten filament, which revolutionized incandescent lighting. It really made for long-lasting light bulbs, and the guy who owned this house invented that. This is a house on Demington, owned by an osteopathic surgeon. This is not a Howell and Thomas design. This is a house on, I think it's Tudor. This is the house of Murphy of Murphy's Oil Soap. Two interesting Howell and Thomas designs on Woodmere. Interesting in that there's a lot of green space in between these two houses, and the reason for that, if we look at the next slide, is because they shared a garage, and actually the driveways went up on opposite sides of the houses and met in the middle in this common garage structure. And the reason for that design feature was to try to create as much green space between the houses as possible. One of the things that helped in this case was that the owners of the houses, it was the wife of the one owner was her mother lived next door, so that's why I suppose they cooperated on that. This is a house on Fairmount Boulevard designed by Howell and Thomas. It's one of the grand houses on Fairmount. This is another house on Woodmere designed by Howell and Thomas. This is an interesting house on North St. James. It's a Howell and Thomas design. This is one example of a house that did change a lot, but very positively, because there was, very early on in its history, there was a huge addition put on the front. And it's hard to tell what the house, you can see features of it today, but it was a very early addition that practically doubled the size of the house. Tennis court right here. The house was owned by the gentleman who developed the Musterol mustard ointment that was very famous in the day. And I'll turn it back to Deanna.
Okay, as Hugh had mentioned that Deming did a lot of marketing, and he did some very innovative things for the time, and one of the things that he did was have actual photographs of homes, and prior to that, People really didn't do that in real estate ads, and we'll be showing you a lot of the ads that he had. In 1914, he published his first brochure, and then in 1921, he had a 50-page booklet that he produced that had lots of photos of the properties as well as a lot of advertisements. We'll show you that. This is the original brochure. It was a four-fold brochure for the Euclid Golf allotment, and a lot of the photos that we showed you earlier are used in it, as well as some drawings by Howell and Thomas architects that you can see up at the top there. And this is the interior of that brochure, and if you look at some of the verbiage, he's talking about a lot of the same things that the Van Smeringens were talking about. He talked a lot about the location being really the best because it's not too far out, not too close in. Talks about the wholesome neighborliness and pride in community, all of those sort of things that people were interested in if they were going to invest in a property at that time. This is a house that we showed you before, a house on Fairmount Boulevard. It's the home of Mrs. B.H. York. Her former residence was Euclid Avenue, and so to some extent, he was successful in getting some people from Euclid Avenue to move up to the Heights, and their next location would be on Fairmount Boulevard. This home was designed by Howell and Thomas. This is the interior and exterior of a Roland White house that's on Delamere Drive. And this is an interesting photo. This house is a spec house, and if you look closely at the photograph, you'll notice that some things look a little bit odd, and that is because this house was not quite done, I guess, when they wanted to take the photo, and so they doctored it up, and they drew in the door. They drew in the tops of these dormers here, drew in these hedges, or somehow tipped in these hedges. So it's kind of an interesting photograph of the time. This is an advertisement that appears in that 50-page booklet for Moet Vapor Heat, and this is a house on Delamere Drive, and we'll show you another photo of this in just a minute, because this is another house, one of the few that had a dramatic exterior change to it, and it had an addition that basically doubled the size of the house. One of the other interesting things about this ad is that they list some of the other people whose homes use their product, and they're doing this because these are very prominent people. There's Mrs. York, Pax, Roland White, et cetera, which is something nobody would ever do today. And this is that same house on Delamere Drive, and you can see how it was changed. This was changed in the 20s, and so it was just a matter of a few short years before it was added on to. And the other thing that Deming did is he advertised really extensively, probably more extensively than I've seen anybody else of that time advertise in Town Topics, which is the society magazine that came out weekly. He had an ad every single week from 1913 up through the 30s. And this is an example, we've got a few examples here of some of the advertisements that he had, and this is a drawing by Howell and Thomas architects that would show you the type of home that was available in Euclid Golf.
This was actually a design that was not built, and Howell and Thomas designed a lot of houses that weren't actually built, we should say it wasn't built in this form. This is actually what was built in that. This is essentially exactly the same house, but whereas the previous one was a French style, this is an English style, and this was this was actually started on speculation, built on speculation by Deming, and it was eventually bought by Alwyn C. Ernst of Ernst & Ernst Accountants, really the founder of modern accounting and consulting.
So as Hugh said, I mean, what would happen a lot is that they would build a house on spec, or they would do drawings of a house, and this is the period, this is the revival style period, and so somebody might like the massing and the layout of the house, but might want a different style, and so that could be done, and this is a case of that. It's another advertisement. They're using, this is the York House on Fairmount Boulevard, the drawing of it, and they're actually advertising the street that's right around the corner from it, Delamere Drive. Another advertisement, another Fairmount Boulevard house, just talking about the, and this particular house is a colonial style house. In fact, they give a little bit more description of it, about it being dignified and substantial and all those kinds of things. And yet another one, this looks like a little picturesque English residence, but it's actually quite a large house. And this house, the double house, it's an interesting story here. This lot is not actually in Euclid Golf, but it's at the very edge of it at the end of Roxborough Road. And what Deming did is he purchased several lots along West St. James there because there was another development that was going on that he didn't really approve of. Right near Roxborough School there was a whole development of 2 families and other more modest homes that he didn't think was in keeping of his vision for Euclid Golf. And so what he did was he purchased a few lots, and he had this double house built at the end of Roxborough. And there's a modern photo of it today. And he purchased these lots too, and had Howell and Thomas design some little cottages that essentially blocked the view of that other neighborhood, so that his constituents in Euclid Golf wouldn't have to look at that other neighborhood.
And that very much was the stated intent. It was to block the view of a less desirable allotment. And as part of our National Register nomination, we included these 3 houses in the nomination, even though they're not officially part of Euclid Golf.
And he saw this as a way to protect their investments. Another advertisement here. This is a very interesting house, one of my favorite and probably one of the most expensive when it was built. What was this, $200,000 when it was built, Hugh?
Yeah, this was designed by, the architect was Reynold Hinsdale. It was actually built completely on speculation by William Cunningham, the builder. And what was interesting is that, first of all, it's construction. It's a steel-framed house with poured concrete. And actually, Cleveland Press articles at the time were likening it to a skyscraper in its construction. It had all the latest gizmos built into it. Very interesting. Well, this was built in 1924, and it was listed for $200,000. Now, just to give you an idea of how expensive that was, this house right around the corner from it was built also in 1924 and was listed for $38,000. This house was built in early 20s on Roxborough and was listed for $45,000. Most Fairmount Boulevard houses were probably going for about $100,000. So at $200,000, that was very expensive.
Mm-hmm. But as you saw from the ad, it had all the bells and whistles, the latest technology, the elevator, the telephone system. It was fireproof, crack-proof, rust-proof, soundproof, probably. Another interesting thing that Deming did is that he did a trade show with the Cleveland Lumber Dealers Association. It's interesting to look at now because obviously so many of the new homes have very little actual wood in them. But this was something that was very critical to home building in the day. And he actually built 10 scale models at this convention. And you can see this railing going along here. This is actually something that people would stand up and walk around. So these are pretty large scale models, and they're complete with all of the lighting and garden features that you would expect to find in one of these homes. This is very similar to that house on North St. James that we showed you earlier, and you can see all the garden features. So this is definitely part of the Garden City thinking.
And that house was actually built in Euclid Golf, and this is it.
This is another house. We showed you the one house that had the garage that was shared. Here's another way to do that. They were really experimenting. What they wanted to do with the Garden City movement is have these large expanses of lawn. So they were experimenting with different ways to achieve that. And here's one way. These 2 homes have a shared driveway and a shared garage. You know, it's one of those ideas that looks great on paper, and then in reality, people didn't want to do it. And with the one case where it did happen in Euclid Golf, those people were relatives. So it did happen. There are a few other examples of it in the Cleveland area, and I'm sure elsewhere, but it wasn't as beneficial, perhaps, as they immediately thought it might be.
Well, in Euclid Golf, there's only the one shared garage that we're aware of. However, there are several shared driveways. Like Chatfield Drive has 2 shared driveways at least. So that was a little bit more common.
Some of the other things you see in other neighborhoods are alleyways. So all of the garages might be on an alleyway, and then you've got the uninterrupted expanse of lawn. So this was another way to perhaps achieve that.
When did they start building garages? About what year? Did automobiles became common?
Yeah, very
Yeah.
early on.
If you look at Euclid Golf homes, which basically started in 1913, any home that was built, say, from 1913 to about 1919, in most cases the garage will be detached behind the home. If after you get to about 1919, 1920, the majority of the homes are starting to have attached garages. So you can see that.
A period when most Cleveland houses did not have garages at all, and then some people used stables.
In some cases, they'd build a house first, and then they would build the garage at some later point in time.
Again, remembering that Euclid Golf was really developed it was the teens and 20s, and cars were far more prevalent. And as Deanna said, most of the early garages were detached. Some of the earliest houses, they didn't necessarily have a garage day one, but a few years later, a garage was erected. And these weren't just one stall garages. They were at least two and
Sometimes
three
three.
stall. Even in the 20s, detached. There's a whole bunch on Chatfield, just as an example of three-car detached garages in their original from the teens and 20s. So cars were real, and people had them.
And this was an upscale neighborhood where you'd see more of that than maybe you would see in other neighborhoods. Just another model from the convention, and some more.
The house on the right was actually built. That's
This is
the
one
house.
that was featured in that brochure. And just to summarize, this is Barton Deming a little bit later in life. When he built his home, he actually achieved national recognition in the Forum, which became Architectural Forum in 1917, because it was a very unique house. If you remember, the lot that it's on is very irregular shaped. It's really only one room wide and several rooms deep. So it was very unusual and was quite a feat to build something like that in its day. So it was featured in Architectural Forum. And then in 1921, he got a whole 15-page article published on the whole allotment itself. And in that article, they really talk about how Deming achieved his goal, which seemed to be pretty unusual for a lot of the developers that I've studied, that he had very high standards. He held everybody to those standards. Euclid Golf was pretty much built out within a very short period of time, from 1913 to 1929. Very few of the homes in Euclid Golf, less than 5% of the structures in Euclid Golf were built after 1930. So it's a very cohesive neighborhood. The deed restrictions were in place. It lived up to his vision and his standards, and it was financially successful. A lot of the other developers, including people like Patrick Calhoun, who went bankrupt, and the Van Swearingen brothers, who eventually went bankrupt, did not pan out. They were not financially successful. Rockefeller was very pleased with this allotment. He was the property owner. He worked with Deming on the lot sizes and the minimum investment levels and the initial prices. He had minimum prices that he could charge for the lots. And in time, Fairmount Boulevard did in fact become known as the Euclid Avenue of the Heights. And Deming kind of started that by using that in his advertisements, but you see from the people who ended up living along Fairmount Boulevard that you could in fact say that it was the Euclid Avenue of the Heights. And because of this cohesiveness, it's one of the reasons why I think the neighborhood has retained its charm and remains very much a very good example of architecture in that period. It's changed very little over the last 80 or so years. And just another picture of Barton Deming in his later years. He continued to be associated with Rockefeller, by the way, and when his daughter married and his wife passed away, she was considerably older than he was, he ended up moving to the Rockefeller building and lived there for a time and became involved in the initial plans for the Forest Hill development that Rockefeller Jr. Did. And just to talk a little bit about some of the architects in Euclid Golf, we mentioned Howell and Thomas, which were the primary architects, and they also oversaw all of the other plans for homes in Euclid Golf. They had approval status. Some of the other architects, some of whom you may know and some of you may not, Charles Schneider, who is the architect for Stan Hewitt Hall in Akron, did a number of homes in Euclid Golf. Harlan Shimon is someone you perhaps don't know of, but he was very prolific at that time in Cleveland, in East Cleveland, and elsewhere in Cleveland Heights, and later on in Shaker Heights. Frederick Strebinger, who was very versatile, and he did everything from shingle-style homes, modest shingle-style homes, to the beautiful Beaux-Arts Tremaine Gallagher House on Fairmount Boulevard. Reynold Hinsdale, we showed you a couple examples already of his work, and Charles Greco, who was from Boston and came to the Heights initially to design the temple, and then the temple on the Heights, and while he was here for that brief period of time, designed a number of homes in the area, including, I think, 3 in Euclid Golf. This first house is a Reynold Hinsdale. This next house is a Shimon.
It's a Greco.
No, it's a Greco, I'm sorry. I always get this one wrong.
This is Frederick Strebinger.
This is a Strebinger. And just to show you the versatility, I think we've got one more Strebinger. This is a shingle-style house. This is a Shimon. And another Shimon, Harlan Shimon. This is a Walker and Weeks. It's the only Walker and Weeks in Euclid Golf. It's on Fairmount Boulevard. And the original owner of this house was the chief engineer for Walker and Weeks. And this is a Charles Schneider. A little bit more about Howell and Thomas. Carl Eugene Howell was originally from Columbus. James Thomas was from Pennsylvania. And they met when they were in school. They went to the University of Pennsylvania. They were roommates. They met there. Carl Howell went back to Columbus and started his own practice there. James Thomas, in the meantime, ended up apprenticing for Cass Gilbert. He entered a contest, and Gilbert noticed him and invited him to join his firm. And then later on, Carl Howell asked James Thomas to come back to Columbus and join his firm. And so they started out in Columbus. There's quite a few neighborhoods in Columbus where you see a lot of Howell and Thomas designs. And then in 1913, we're not quite sure how, but Deming selected them to be the chief architects for Euclid Golf. And so they established a Cleveland office, and a number of architects who were working for them came up to Cleveland with them to start work on Euclid Golf. And in total, we think they designed about 176 homes in the Euclid Golf area, including Deming's own home. And then they went on from there to design many homes in Shaker Heights. And then when the Depression hit, Carl Howell passed away, and James Thomas continued on the firm, and the way he was able to survive through the Depression was by designing a lot of newspaper plants. And so his firm then became known for newspaper plants, and he ended up settling in Hudson, Ohio. And his son was an architect. His grandsons, in fact, still live on the family estate in Hudson.
And we'll tell you a story about that in just a minute.
This is Howell Thomas offices, and you might recognize these buildings. They're still in existence. They're along Carnegie Avenue. One of the buildings was their office, and next door was a landscape architect that they often worked with. I think now one of them is a daycare center. And this is a picture of James Thomas. And the reason why we have this photo is because we've been in contact with the family in Hudson. And Hugh, probably you should tell this story if you can.
Others.
Okay.
Yeah, we, as part of our research, we were, we also collect these materials as well. And we were looking for descendants of the Thomas family, and we knew they were in Hudson. We finally were able to make contact with them, find them, and when we contacted them, we told them what we were doing. They were thrilled that somebody had taken an interest in, lost the mic. They were thrilled that someone had taken an interest in their grandfather's firm, and one of the things we asked was, do you happen to have any materials, any drawings or anything like that? And what they said was that, we think that there might be some drawings up in grandfather's old house. This was kind of a big compound, and there were several houses on it. and James Thomas's house was still there, and they were renting it out. And he said, "Well, we think that there might be some things in that house, but we'll have to let you know." A year elapsed, and they called out of the blue and said, "Well, you know what? We were wrong. There's not a few drawings. There's thousands of drawings." And it turned out that the entire architectural practice of Howell Thomas was up in an unheated attic for about 50 years. James Thomas had thrown it all up there, and these weren't blueprints. These are all the original drawings for all of these houses in Bexley. And this is significant because most papers from architectural firms disappear over the years, and here is an entire, very important collection that was still intact, and that got the interest of the family, which was good because we urged them to preserve these, and what they did do was they donated the entire collection to the Cleveland Public Library, which was huge. This is gigantic, and it's being preserved by the Cleveland Public Library. These are some of the drawings that were found, and just to show you some of the Howell and Thomas's talent. This is actually an unusual house because it was one of the few that was done outside of Northeast Ohio or outside of Ohio. This was actually done in Lincoln, Nebraska, and that's the floor plan for that house. This is a house in Euclid Golf, the Charles Forster house. It's on Delamere. That's the house today. This is a house also on Delamere by Howell and Thomas. They also did some interior work, and this is actually the interior for the dining room or tea room of the Lazarus department store in Columbus. They actually did a lot of work for the Lazarus family, including work on the Lazarus department store building itself. Deanna and I went down to Columbus to do some reconnaissance, and unfortunately the old tea room no longer exists. They did, I just mentioned they did work for the Lazarus family. This was actually the house of Frederick Lazarus himself, the chairman of Lazarus department store, and that's the house itself as it stands today in Bexley, just outside of Columbus. This is another Lazarus family house in Bexley, done by Howell and Thomas. Another Howell and Thomas in Bexley. This is another Euclid Golf house. This is on Ardley Drive. This is actually, this was called the Home in Good Taste. It was one of the kind of the model houses at the time, a Howell and Thomas. Another Howell and Thomas on Delamere. This is a nice, quaint little English cottage. It's actually a very large house. This is a house on the corner of Delamere and Fairmount. Sorry for the quality of the photo, but they were very versatile. And just another example of the versatility of Howell and Thomas. This is a house on Fairmount Boulevard at Woodmere. We did a website as well. We urge you to buy our book, but if you don't want to, there's a website out there as well. All of the vintage photographs that you saw, we were successful in uncovering those. We actually, as part of our research, we found the son of one of Howell and Thomas's designers. Herman Albrecht was his name, and he actually went on to start his own firm. But what Herman Albrecht did was, when he left the Howell and Thomas firm, he took a huge sheaf of photographs with him, and those were everything that you just saw. All those shots of the area before it was developed and the houses under construction. These are all photographs that Herman Albrecht had taken with him, and none of them had ever been seen before. And when we contacted his son, he said, "Yeah, I got some stuff. Come and look at it." And so it's an example that and the Howell and Thomas family drawings are examples of how important it is to dig and dig and dig and dig, because you really find some amazing stuff. And all these things were things that people had never seen before. So it was a great process. Any questions right now?
How easy would it be for me to go downtown and get information about our house, like what the price was? I am kind of amazed at the prices for these places, because I have the impression prices were still about the same up until about the mid-'70s when they really began to escalate. Well, I won't say any more than that. Somebody else wants to talk, I'm sure.
Well, let me try to answer your first question. You asked if we had any information about what Euclid Avenue was like in the 20s. Well, Euclid Avenue was a mixture at that point. There was a lot of encroachment from industry. Actually, a good example, current day example, if you're interested, is to come down to the Sarah Benedict House, the headquarters of the Cleveland Restoration Society, and take a look at Prospect Avenue there. Because I really love that street, that little section there, because it really gives you an idea of kind of what happened to these streets. Unfortunately, Euclid Avenue has had so many changes that there's very little left there. But if you go one block south on Prospect, you kind of see the transformation. You see the Sarah Benedict House, which is an example of one of the grand houses that was there, and then next door to it, a little bit down, you see some row houses, which would have been sort of the next step. You see some apartment buildings, some very grand apartment buildings. So people might have torn down a house or might have built on a side lot. They might have built townhomes or they might have built apartment buildings. And then you see sort of the next iteration of commercial buildings. And on Prospect Avenue, you see a lot of the buildings there that were originally auto showrooms. So a lot of the automobile dealers had their showrooms there. So it's kind of this real mix of uses on this one street. So it's very interesting to see sort of this pieces of history as you walk down the street. And I would imagine that was pretty much what you would see of Euclid Avenue as well. That was what the change that was happening in the 20s. And I think your second question was, how easy would it be for you to do some research on a house? If it's in Cuyahoga County, there are several things that you could do. Probably the best place to start would be to go to the Cuyahoga County Archives, and you'll need your parcel number and your address, and they can help you there find old plat maps, and you can locate it on the map, find out what original development it was part of. It might say something on your property deed, too, about anybody who lives in Euclid Golf. You might wonder why it says Euclid Golf allotment on your deed, and that's why, because it was originally part of this development. You can also, a lot of times, find photographs, old photographs from, say, the 40s, 50s, 60s, to get a better idea of what your house may have looked like back then. On the maps, too, you can usually find previous owners. You can look at tax records. You have to go to another place for that, but those are some of the things you could do.
Once you have the original owners of your property, the best thing to do is then to go to the city directory and look those people up, because what they did was they listed also everybody's occupation at that time. So that's a great way to start. There's a zillion rocks that you got to turn over, and actually I'd urge you to talk to Cara Hamley O'Donnell about that, because she's got the whole story on that.
If you're lucky enough to live in Cleveland Heights and be researching property, I think that would be my first stop, is to talk to her, because she's got a database of building permits and would definitely be able to point you in the right direction.
Deanna, can I add a couple bit to
Where's
what
that
you
mic?
said?
Oh, you got that mic. Okay.
I stole it.
I can't see.
Two things regarding the gentleman's question. First of all, the millionaire segment of Euclid Avenue is basically considered to go to roughly East 46th Street, but Euclid Avenue, by the turn of the century and certainly well into the 20s, was basically residential all the way out to Doan's Corners, or what is now East 105th Street. So the fact that your father lived on Euclid Avenue, it could be anywhere from the mansions that occupied roughly Public Square out to about East 55th Street. Or it could be a somewhat more modest home that was occupied by the middle class or the upper middle class, such as it was all the way from East 55th out to East 105th Street or Doan's Corners. The single best reference that you may find outside of making a trip to the archives would be to pick up a copy of Jan Cigliano's Euclid Avenue Showcase of America book, which does not limit itself exclusively to the Millionaire's Row segment of Euclid Avenue, but basically runs the gamut from Public Square to Doan's Corners, and has wonderful photographs of just hundreds upon hundreds of homes that run the entire length of Euclid Avenue, and who knows, your dad's could be one of them.
Other questions?
I'm going to pass the mic up here.
You said in the design of the area, the lot sizes, other than Fairmount themselves, the lot sizes were fairly small in a way, and Rockefeller wanted that. Was that because he saw Calhoun fail, or was there some other reason that they chose to sort of downscale most of the area when they could have been going very high end for the whole area?
Well, it's partly the reason. I think they saw that areas like Calhoun's, Euclid Heights, and the Van Swearingen brothers, the initial Shaker Village, had larger lots as well, and they really weren't selling that well. So Rockefeller was very interested in turning a profit on this, and he looked at some other developments. There's one we didn't really talk about. There's an allotment called the Hindi Coal allotment that's nearby, and Rockefeller looked at that one in particular and noticed how well that allotment was doing, and it had more modest homes on it. Quite a bit larger than what you would find on, say, Grandview and Belfield, but not nearly as large as what you would find in Calhoun's Euclid Heights. And he said, this guy's onto something here. And what he really liked about Deming's plan is that it had the larger homes along Fairmount Boulevard and the larger lots, and then when you got to the side streets, it had much more modest homes and more modest lots. And in fact, Deming's initial sales were almost exclusively on the smaller side streets, and many of the spec houses that he did on Fairmount Boulevard, weren't sold until later.
And when we say modest on the side streets, they're anything from 3,500 square feet to 5,000 square feet on the side streets. So that's
more modest.
More modest, right? Right.
Yes, that guy behind.
How far did the streetcar eventually go out Fairmount, and how long ago was that removed?
Let's see, how far did it go? Well, you know where the Baptist Church is on Fairmount. That's essentially, I believe, how far it went. And one way you can tell is the streetcar poles are still there in the median strip. And if you get an eye for those and keep following those until they end, that is exactly where the streetcar ended. Now, the Van Swearingen brothers, when they got the spur out in 1906 to go down Fairmount Boulevard, then later, and I believe this is probably 1912 time period, they got a little spur to go down Coventry, south of Fairmount. And so you notice that Coventry is a boulevard at that point, whereas north of Fairmount, it is not a boulevard. So they actually had a little spur that went south from that period, and that only lasted for a few years until they bought the Nickel Plate Railroad and were able to get a direct line from the southern area, which is now the city of Shaker Heights, directly to downtown Cleveland. And then they didn't need that Coventry line anymore, so they removed that. And then the Fairmount line, I think, was at least in place until the 40s.
Right.
50s even.
50s? Okay.
It was a place for World War II.
I was interested that you mentioned several times about the rather grandiose homes in the Euclid Heights division, which is where we are. And those were built somewhat before Demington. And I can only think of a few. And were some of them torn down, or were there only a few of them and then the infill was more modest homes?
There were quite a number of them, and many of them are gone.
Ah.
Many of the biggest houses are gone.
This is not Euclid Heights what we're saying.
This
Right.
is not anymore?
No, never was.
Well,
Never was. We're outside the boundaries of Euclid Heights. This is actually more the forest, our borderline of Mayfield Heights, which was developed by and then Brown and Grant Deming's. It's kind of the confluence of Deming's.
Euclid Heights went to Coventry.
only went to Coventry?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
This is much further west.
Okay, all right. And I had one other thing about houses on Euclid Avenue. It has been my understanding that some of them, at least, and that may have been infrequent, were torn down by the owners so that they would not be subdivided into apartments.
That's supposedly true, yeah.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And some did meet their fate that way. Most of them were just abandoned or turned into apartments, tenements, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. There is one house on Fairmount Boulevard that was torn down by the owner per his will. that when both he and his wife passed away, that the house be torn down. I'm trying to remember the name of the house, but it's the Harold T. Clark House, right? And that's not in the Euclid Golf section, that's in the Shaker Village section of Fairmount Boulevard, but only one example of that on Fairmount.
Questions?
So the Euclid Heights section was developed at the same time or prior to this?
Well, when Patrick Calhoun was developing Euclid Heights, that would have been prior to Euclid Golf, because Euclid Golf didn't start until the Euclid Golf Club disbanded, which was around the time that Calhoun went bankrupt. And there was a sheriff's sale on the remainder of the property, and so a number of different developers then got hold of parcels of Euclid Heights and did different things with them. That's where a lot of the apartment homes come from, a lot of the smaller homes that would not have fit within Calhoun's grand vision of Euclid Heights came from, but certainly add to the mix.
Euclid Heights it began to be developed in the late 1890s.
Was there anything else going on with Calhoun's development that caused him to fail, other than, I mean, the lots weren't selling?
There were lots of ups and downs in the real estate market through the decades. Particularly that time was very volatile for real estate development. In fact, what's interesting is you look at the Euclid Golf advertisements that Deming was doing. You can trace the ups and downs of real estate values, even from 1913 to 1929 when he was developing it. There were booms and busts, and he was talking about in some ads, by now, the values are low, they're sure to go up. And so it was going all over the place. It was pretty crazy. And then couple that with these houses that were really Euclid Avenue size houses that people couldn't afford eventually. Income tax came along, and it was more expensive to staff those houses. So a lot of reasons.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, we didn't have any of this in our presentation, they don't make good slides, but we have a lot of letters from the Rockefeller archives going back and forth between Barton Deming and the Abington Realty Company, which was Rockefeller's realty company. And in some of the letters, Barton Deming is asking for more money. He agreed to certain prices with Rockefeller, and then he finds that, of course, now the developers had to put in the sewers, they had to put in the streets, they had to put in the lighting, they had to do all of those things. And so, there's one letter he's writing to Rockefeller's company saying, I did all these things, and now I need more money to build the spec houses so that people have something to see.
Was there at that time anything resembling zoning or anything that would have been government standards or restrictions that they had to work to?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. There wasn't any zoning at the time, and Barton Deming actually is one of the people who was on the committee in Cleveland Heights that was the original zoning board of Cleveland Heights. So it was just being developed in the 20s, and Barton Deming was one of the proponents of zoning, and it was actually one of the people who brought it about in the Heights. But prior to that, the only way that a developer could control what was going on at on the property was through deed restrictions. And Patrick Calhoun had some deed restrictions, Van Swearingen's had some deed restrictions, Deming had deed restrictions. And this would be things like, it would specifically say in there, no apartment houses, no boarding houses, no taverns, no commercial purposes, no outbuildings.
Anything
for
about
example,
race or religion?
Not in Deming's or in any of those earlier ones were those types of clauses. But I think that comes up a lot because in later Shaker Heights, and this is the area that would be east of Warrensville, there was a deed restriction to that effect. But noticing when you look at the advertisements and you hear them talking about areas of refinement and the right kind of people, I mean, there was a lot of informal stuff that happened.
Could I comment on that?
Sure.
Can you hold on a second, please?
Yeah, sure. 1924, Euclid versus somebody. The Supreme Court of the U.S. Ruled that zoning was, could continue. Before that, there was no way. It was challenged all the time. So it's only 1924 when the Supreme Court said it could stick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm amazed at the wonderful craftsmanship in all those houses that were being built in Euclid Golf and that whole area. And I'm wondering if you have any information on where the builders came from. Were there pockets of stonemasons or the carpentry or Italians that might have done the stonework?
We do know some information about some of the builders that worked in Euclid Golf area. Some we'd like to know more about. In fact, and a number of the builders may actually have built homes without an architect. In fact, I don't know if you want to comment a little bit more on that. But some of the builders, I know one builder sort of got involved in being a builder because he married a woman whose family was in the lumber business, and he just sort of learned the trade and began building one house that the family would live in, and then they'd sell that one while he was building another, and they'd move to the next one. And so some interesting stories about some of the builders, and Hugh uncovered one.
Well, actually, I think it's important to distinguish between real estate investors who call themselves builders, and they're really bringing money together and building houses, and they're really investment speculators. Unlike, for instance, Deming, who actually was he was an investment, he was a real estate speculator, but he also had a building company, and he had crews of employees who did the work. Other builders subbed it all out. And yes, to your point, there were, certainly at the time, there were lots of highly skilled craftspeople. And not all old houses are well built, too. I mean, the technology at the time wasn't so great. The materials were good, but not all the technology was good. So really where you see the craftsmanship is in stonework and ironwork. And just as an example, actually the 50-page brochure that Deming published had a lot of advertisements for the companies that did work in Euclid Golf, including like Rose Iron Works, which is still in business today. They did, much of the iron work in Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights. So that's.
Yeah, you had a lot of immigration going on then too, so you had a lot of people coming from Europe who knew these trades and were available at very low prices to builders and developers.
Another thing that tended to make the Euclid Golf neighborhood, as well as Euclid Heights, a mecca for high-end development, was the presence of the immediate proximity of quarries, stone quarries. Roxborough Ravine, for example, was a major stone quarry, and a huge percentage of the upper level homes that were built in Cleveland Heights used or incorporated stone that came out of the Roxborough Ravine. There were also other quarries along Monticello, what is now Monticello Boulevard, as well as Euclid Creek. Euclid Creek was a huge source of bluestone and limestone for building throughout the east side of Cleveland.
And I'm told that the stone that the Deming house is built of was quarried right from Fairmount Boulevard when they were cutting Fairmount Boulevard through.
Other questions right now?
Mr. History Professor?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the influences on the architects. I know the idea behind the Garden City movement was sort of born of social utopianism, and yet clearly these developments are high-end, sort of imitating the English aristocracy. Who did the architects look to? I mean, did they go to England and study English manor houses, that sort of thing? What were their influences?
Well, that's a...
Well, we're not experts in that. We would guess that certainly some did, but I would wager that most architects got their inspiration by looking at Architectural Forum and the various books that were being published, because there were architects' libraries were filled with reference books on how to design certain styles and what certain styles looked like. And it was, I think, probably more a matter of taste at the time. I had mentioned earlier that the early Euclid Golf houses looked very different than the later ones, mainly because the tastes changed, and the early ones were more overtly American in style.
arts
Prairie
and
influences,
crafts.
arts and crafts, shingle style, and later took on the forms of the revival styles, Tudors and that sort of thing.
And part of it had to do with the architect's training. To give an example, one of the architects I mentioned was Harlan Shimon, who I don't know for sure, but I think he did not have any formal in terms of going to university to learn architecture. I think that he started out as a draftsman and worked his way up and became an architect. And I think that's one of the reasons, even though he was so prolific, I mean, he had as many as 20-some houses being built at one time that he designed, that he's not given a lot of respect from the other architects in his profession because he, I think, was never a member of the AIA, which was just being formed at that time, and didn't have the professional training as someone like Frederick Strebinger, who went to Paris to study. Other architects, you remember World War I happened, and so a lot of people were over there. I know at least one of the architects, Harold Fullerton, who was from Youngstown, did serve in the Army in Europe, and he did a number of homes in the Cleveland area. And all of his homes are very precise revival styles. And you have to wonder, did he make sketches when he was over there because his designs are so exact. So after World War I, you start seeing more of these revival styles, both because the profession was evolving and people were becoming classically trained, and because people had been over to Europe and had experienced all of those older styles and were bringing them back.
But many architects, like Howell and Thomas, for instance, they were capable of doing very pure styles, but a lot of their designs are a little bit more eclectic. You might have a very classical colonial, for instance, with exposed rafter tails, kind of some craftsman influence. So there was a lot of that going on. We have two really interesting photographs from the collection. One shows a house under construction on, I think it's Woodmere, and its original entryway was very craftsman looking. And in fact, the original drawings show this craftsman styled entryway. A shot a year later of the completed house, that entryway is not there. The house was actually completed with a very classical pedimented entryway. So what happened there? Don't know. Did Deming say, you know what, I want something a little more classical? Did the new owner have it changed before it was finished? Who knows? But there's a lot of transition going on at that time.
Do you know if the porch went on that house, it was built at a time that most new American houses had porches. Did the porch go at that house when it was out of style and when they wanted everything to look European, or did the porch just go out of disrepair in later years, or I'm just curious?
We don't know. We didn't realize that it had a porch until we found the original drawings and photographs, so don't know.
Yeah.
A lot of the houses behind, in that area they tried to cover up, they have the porches,
Right.
Right, and most of the homes in Euclid Golf do not have porches,
Right.
and that was one of the things, the Van Swerengens hated porches. They thought it was very pedestrian.
These are very American, these porches.
Yeah.
This kind of porch.
Right. Mm-hmm. Any final questions?
I really enjoyed your lecture.
Wait for the mic.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could tell me the Charles Deming, is his name Charles? No. Barton Deming house. What is it? I know that it's still there on Fairmount and we all see it, but I don't really know how many condos or how many apartments it's been converted into. Can you talk a little bit about its use today, how it's being lived in?
Well, it is an apartment building. A couple in Shaker Heights owns it, and I think there's about 5 apartments there. Some of there are some grander apartments, and then there are some smaller apartments in there. I think there are probably 2 apartments that are pretty much run the full length of the house, and I think there's one in the basement and maybe a couple in the upper floors. So it's about 4 or 5, I think. I've only seen one of the apartments in there.
Well, thank you very much.